Brother's betrayal, cheating wife, DNA test, $4 million inheritance, and unexpected redemption. You were right about me all along. I'm a coward. I used to blame you for everything wrong in my life, but the truth is I ruined my own life. Karen and it was never about love. It was about me trying to prove I was better than you, and I failed. Imagine discovering not only that your wife has been unfaithful, but that your brother is the one she's been cheating with. Now, add a shocking DNA test, a $4 million inheritance on the line, and a twist no one saw coming. This isn't just a betrayal. It's a collision of lies, greed, and an unexpected path to redemption. Thomas, you might want to sit down for this, the doctor said, sliding a folded piece of paper across his desk. My stomach churned, nausea rising in my throat. This wasn't just about me, it was about my son. Jake was 3 years old, with my dark hair and Karen's piercing green eyes. At least, that's what I had always believed. The doctor's face betrayed no emotion, but his words carried a weight that crushed me. We ran the tests multiple times to ensure accuracy. I'm sorry. I stared at the paper on the desk. I couldn't bring myself to pick it up. Instead, I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. You're telling me he's not my son? Silence. It hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. When I finally forced myself to grab the paper, my hands shook so badly that I almost dropped it. The words were clinical and cold. Excluded as biological father. Probability of paternity, 0%. The room spun. My head throbbed. My chest felt like it was caving in as I crumpled the paper in my grip. I glanced up at the doctor, whose carefully measured gaze only fueled my fury. Is there any chance? Anyone else? He asked cautiously, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. Images flooded my mind, each one worse than the last. Karen's sly smirks, the late-night errand she started running months ago, her defensiveness whenever I questioned why Donald, my older brother, had been stopping by so often. Donald! The realization hit like a bullet to the chest. My grip on the paper loosened, and it slipped from my hand onto the desk. The doctor said something else, but I didn't hear him. My ears buzzed with a deafening hum, drowning out everything but the chaos in my own mind. Every fiber of my being screamed in denial, but deep down, I knew. I saw it now. The way Jake's face lit up when Donald walked into the room, the offhand comments Donald made about how much he adored kids, the way Karen would stiffen when I jokingly suggested Donald babysit. I need to go, I said, cutting the doctor off mid-sentence. My voice was cold and steady, but inside I was a storm. The drive home was a blur. I didn't see the traffic, the lights, or even the road ahead of me. My mind replayed every little moment I'd ignored, every red flag I'd dismissed. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I walked into the house, Karen was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened, like my entire world hadn't just been set on fire. How was the appointment? She asked, not even looking up. I stared at her, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every ounce of trust I'd ever had in this woman evaporated in an instant. She had lied to me, manipulated me, and now she was acting as though everything was fine. I stepped closer, my voice low but trembling with fury. Karen, we need to talk. Finally, she looked up, her expression shifting from confusion to something else. Panic? What's going on, Thomas? She asked, her tone too casual, too rehearsed. I dropped the crumpled test results onto the coffee table in front of her. Explain this? Her eyes flicked to the paper and then back to me. For a second, just a second, I saw the truth in her expression before she masked it with indignation. What is this? She asked, playing dumb. You know exactly what it is, I snapped, my voice rising. Jake isn't mine. So tell me, Karen, tell me whose son he is. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. And then, instead of breaking down or confessing, she did something that shocked me to my core. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or a guilty one. It was cold, sharp, and cruel. You're seriously doing this right now? She said, crossing her arms. You're really going to accuse me like that? Maybe the problem is you, Thomas. Did you ever think about that? My blood boiled. She wasn't even trying to deny it. Instead, she was deflecting, twisting the blame back onto me as if this was somehow my fault. Don't play games with me, I said, stepping closer. You've been lying to me for years. Is it Donald? Is he Jake's father? Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she looked genuinely angry. You have no idea what you're talking about, she hissed. Donald? Really? You're out of your mind. But her voice cracked on his name, just barely, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I stood there, staring at Karen as the seconds dragged on, each one loaded with unspoken accusations and denials. Her smugness melted away as the silence stretched. I wanted her to speak, to say something, anything, but her defiance only made my fury grow. Thomas, this is insane. She finally spat, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Why are you even entertaining this nonsense? A piece of paper? You're better than that. I picked up the crumpled test results and slammed them back onto the table, leaning in until I was close enough to see her pupils dilate. Better than that? Better than wanting to know if the child I've raised and loved for 3 years is even mine? Better than demanding to know if my own brother betrayed me? Don't you dare lecture me about being better. Her mouth tightened, and she leaned back on the couch, crossing her legs as though we were having a casual argument over dinner. I don't know what you think you're proving here, she said with forced calm, but the way she said your little conspiracy theories snapped something inside me. She wasn't scared, remorseful, or even defensive. She was dismissive, as though my pain was an inconvenience, as though I was the problem. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and turned toward the kitchen. I needed a second to think, to process, but as I reached for a glass of water, I saw it. Her phone, carelessly left on the counter. The screen lit up as a notification came in. Donald, can we talk? My chest tightened, and without hesitation, I snatched up the phone. Karen bolted off the couch like I'd set her on fire. Thomas, don't you dare touch my phone, she shrieked, her mask slipping for the first time. Oh, now you care? I shot back, holding the phone just out of her reach. Let's see what Donald has to say, shall we? Give it back, she yelled, lunging at me. But I sidestepped her easily, my height and years of frustration giving me the upper hand. My fingers worked quickly, unlocking the phone with her passcode. A birthday I'd lovingly remembered for 8 years. Funny how those little things stick with you, even as everything else crumbles. Her screams turned into pleading as I scrolled through her messages. Thomas, please, you're going to twist things, you're going to misunderstand. Misunderstand? I barked, my voice cracking with disbelief. What's to misunderstand about this? The screen displayed months of messages, flirty jokes, inside references, and worse, plans to meet up when I was out of town for work. My hands shook as I read each one, but it wasn't until I found the photos that the room seemed to tilt. Karen, in the lingerie I'd seen her buy, but never wear for me, posing in front of the mirror with captions like "Can't wait for tonight." It wasn't just betrayal, it was mockery. She'd used the life I built for her, for us, as the backdrop for her deceit. And Donald? He was the willing participant, feeding into her games, encouraging her lies. I turned the phone toward her. So, this is what you've been doing during your girls' nights? Dressing up for my brother? Karen's face turned white, and for the first time, she looked genuinely panicked. Thomas, you're overreacting. It's not what it looks like. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that even surprised me. Not what it looks like. There are pictures, Karen. Explicit pictures. What could it possibly look like other than the truth? Her lips trembled as she tried to come up with an excuse, but no words came. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, and for once, I didn't feel sorry for her. I took a step closer, towering over her. How long, Karen? How long have you and Donald been making a fool out of me? Her voice came out small and shaky. It didn't mean anything. It was just a mistake. A mistake? I shouted, the word exploding out of me like a bullet. Mistakes don't last for months. Mistakes don't create children. That's when her mask cracked completely. Her tears came fast and heavy, but they weren't the kind that spoke of guilt or regret. They were self-pity, the tears of someone who wasn't sorry for what they did, only sorry for being caught. Thomas, please, she sobbed, reaching for me. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away because of one stupid mistake. I yanked my arm away before she could touch me. No, Karen. You threw everything away. You and Donald. And now you're going to face the consequences. Karen's tears quickly transformed into something uglier. Anger. Her face twisted, and she pointed a shaking finger at me. You're such a self-righteous prick, Thomas. Always playing the victim. Maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have needed to look somewhere else for attention. The words hit me like a slap, but this time I didn't flinch. I stared at her, unblinking, as she let the venom spill. It was almost laughable. She wasn't even trying to apologize or explain anymore. She was attacking me, as if I were the one who had done something wrong. You're pathetic, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. And you know what's worse? I don't think you even care about Jake. You care about your little games, your stupid lies, and your disgusting affair with my brother. But Jake? You used him to keep me in the dark, didn't you? Karen froze, her eyes darting toward Jake's bedroom door down the hall. Don't bring him into this, she hissed. Oh, I'm bringing him into this, I shot back, stepping closer. You made him part of this the moment you decided to let Donald into our lives. Thomas, you might want to sit down for this, the doctor said, sliding a folded paper across his desk. My stomach churned, nausea rising in my throat. This wasn't just about me. It was about my son. Jake was 3 years old, with my dark hair and Karen's piercing green eyes. At least, that's what I had always believed. The doctor's face betrayed no emotion, but his words carried a weight that crushed me. We ran the tests multiple times to ensure accuracy. I'm sorry. I stared at the paper on the desk. I didn't pick it up. Couldn't. Instead, I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. You're telling me he's not my son? Silence hung in the air, thicker than concrete. When I finally forced myself to grab the paper, my hand shook so badly, I nearly dropped it. The words were clinical and cold. Excluded as biological father. Probability of paternity, 0%. The room spun, my head throbbed, my chest felt like it was caving in. My grip tightened on the paper, crumpling it. I glanced up at the doctor, whose carefully measured gaze only fueled my fury. Is there any chance? Anyone else? He asked cautiously, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. Images flooded my mind, each one worse than the last. Karen's sly smirks. The late-night errand she started running months ago. Her odd defensiveness whenever I questioned why Donald, my older brother, had been stopping by so often. Donald. The realization hit like a bullet to the chest. My grip on the paper slackened, and it slipped from my hand onto the desk. The doctor said something else, but I didn't hear him. My ears buzzed with a deafening hum, drowning out everything but the chaos in my own mind. Every fiber of my being screamed in denial, but deep down, I knew. I saw it now. The way Jake's face lit up when Donald walked into the room, the offhand comments Donald made about how much he adored kids, the way Karen would stiffen if I jokingly suggested Donald babysit. I need to go, I said, cutting the doctor off mid-sentence. My voice was cold and steady, but inside, I was a storm. The drive home was a blur. I didn't see the traffic, the lights, or even the road ahead of me. My mind replayed every little moment I'd ignored, every red flag I'd dismissed. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I walked into the house, Karen was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened, like my entire world hadn't just been set on fire. How was the appointment? She asked, not even looking up. I stared at her, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every ounce of trust I'd ever had in this woman evaporated in an instant. She had lied to me, manipulated me, and now she was acting as though everything was fine. I stepped closer, my voice low but trembling with fury. Karen, we need to talk. Finally, she looked up, her expression shifting to confusion and then, very briefly, to something else. Panic? What's going on, Thomas? She asked, her tone too casual, too rehearsed. I dropped the crumpled test results onto the coffee table in front of her. Explain this? Her eyes flicked to the paper and then back to me. For a second, just a second, I saw the truth in her expression before she masked it with indignation. What is this? She asked, playing dumb. You know exactly what it is, I snapped, my voice rising. Jake isn't mine. So tell me, Karen, tell me whose son he is. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. And then, instead of breaking down or confessing, she did something that shocked me to my core. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or a guilty one. It was cold, sharp, and cruel. "You're seriously doing this right now?" she said, crossing her arms. "You're really going to accuse me like that? Maybe the problem is you, Thomas. Did you ever think about that?" My blood boiled. She wasn't even trying to deny it. Instead, she was deflecting, twisting the blame back onto me like this was somehow my fault. "Don't play games with me," I said, stepping closer. "You've been lying to me for years. Is it Donald? Is he Jake's father?" Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she looked genuinely angry. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she hissed. "Donald? Really? You're out of your mind." But her voice cracked on his name, just barely. And that was all the confirmation I needed. The sound of tires screeching outside grabbed both our attention. I turned toward the window just in time to see Donald's car pull into the driveway. Of course, the coward couldn't even wait for me to leave the house before running to her rescue. I stormed toward the front door, ignoring Karen's desperate protests. "Thomas, don't please. Let me handle this." "Oh, I'll handle it," I growled, throwing the door open just as Donald stepped out of his car. He looked exactly how I expected, sheepish but trying to play it cool, his hands stuffed into his pockets like we were about to have a friendly chat. "Thomas," he began, his tone oily and condescending. "Let's just take a minute to calm down," and I didn't let him finish. I closed the distance between us in 3 long strides and shoved him backwards so hard he stumbled into the side of his car. "Calm down?" I snarled, my voice booming. "You've been screwing my wife, you sick bastard. You think we're just going to sit down and talk about it over coffee? Donald is no longer welcome in this family. As far as I'm concerned, he's dead to us." Hearing those words gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction, but it didn't change the chaos unfolding in front of me. "I need to go," I said, ending the call before either of them could respond. Karen stopped pacing the moment she saw me put the phone down. "Thomas, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice high-pitched and desperate. "I told my parents," I said flatly. "They know everything." Her face paled, and she took a step back, shaking her head. "You had no right to do that. This is private between us." I scoffed, crossing my arms. "Private? You think you deserve privacy after what you've done?" "No, Karen. This stopped being private the moment you dragged my brother into our marriage." Her eyes darted toward the front door, where Donald was still sulking. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake, Thomas. Just a stupid mistake." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Mistake? Mistakes don't last for years. Mistakes don't create children. This wasn't a mistake, Karen. This was a choice. And you made it over and over again." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the gears turning in her head as she tried to spin this in her favor. "Fine," she snapped. "I made a mistake, okay? But what are you going to do? Ruin Jake's life because you're too stubborn to forgive me? He doesn't know anything about this. He's innocent." "Innocent?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "You don't get to use him as a shield. He's the only person in this house who's innocent. And that's exactly why I'm going to do whatever it takes to protect him from you and Donald." Karen's face twisted in rage, and she stormed toward me, jabbing a finger into my chest. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a bitter little man who can't handle the fact that his wife wanted more than he could give her." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. We both froze, staring at each other. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the tension in the room felt like it could snap at any moment. Karen darted toward the door, but I grabbed her wrist, stopping her. "Who is it?" I demanded, my voice low and threatening. "Let me go, Thomas," she hissed, struggling against my grip. I didn't budge. "Answer me. Who is it?" Her eyes darted toward the window, and her silence spoke volumes. My stomach dropped as I realized she called someone. Probably Donald's idea, a last-ditch effort to control the situation. I released her wrist and yanked the door open, half expecting to see a cop or one of her friends. But instead, there stood our neighbor, Susan, clutching a casserole dish and looking more awkward than ever. I heard yelling," she said, glancing between Karen and me. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay. Karen immediately plastered on a fake smile, her voice sickly sweet. Oh, everything's fine. Just a little disagreement. Thanks for checking, though. I didn't even bother to respond. I slammed the door shut, cutting Susan off mid-sentence, and turned back to Karen. This is how you handle things now? Calling in the neighbors to play damage control, I said, my voice dripping with disgust. Karen didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her coat and stormed toward the door. I'm leaving, she announced. And when I come back, you'd better have calmed down, Thomas. I stepped aside, letting her leave without a fight. Don't bother coming back, I muttered as she walked out, slamming the door behind her. The house fell silent except for the faint sound of Jake stirring in his room. My fists clenched at my sides, and I took a deep breath, staring at the wreckage Karen and Donald had left in their wake. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning started with a knock on the door that jolted me from the restless sleep I'd managed to grab on the couch. I stumbled to the door, rubbing my face, and opened it to find my parents standing there. My mom's face was tight with worry, while my dad looked like he was barely containing his fury. Where is he? My dad barked, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. Not here, I said flatly, motioning toward the driveway. He stayed in his car most of the night, but I didn't see him this morning, probably licking his wounds somewhere. My dad's jaw tightened, and he dropped his overnight bag onto the floor. Good. It's better for him if I don't see his face right now. My mom followed him inside, her gaze darting around the living room and landing on the crumpled DNA test results still on the coffee table. She sat down, smoothing the paper out with trembling hands. Thomas, she said softly, her voice breaking. How could he do this? How could she do this? And Jake? What's going to happen to him? I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms tightly over my chest. Jake's my priority now. Karen's been lying to me for years, and I'll be damned if I let her and Donald mess up his life any more than they already have. My dad nodded firmly. We'll help however we can. If Karen and Donald think they're going to fight you on this, they've got another thing coming. I appreciated the sentiment, but the reality of what lay ahead was crushing. Karen hadn't come back last night, but I knew she wouldn't stay away forever. She'd fight tooth and nail to keep control, and Donald? He'd probably fan the flames just because he could. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up and saw Karen's name flashing on the screen. My stomach twisted, but I answered. What do you want, Karen? I said, skipping any pretense of civility. Her voice was sharp, like she'd been rehearsing her lines all morning. We need to talk. You can't just cut me out of Jake's life because you're angry. I laughed bitterly. Cut you out? Karen, you've done that to yourself. You think you get to play the victim here? You lied to me. You cheated, and you used Jake as a pawn to cover it all up. I'm his mother, Thomas, she snapped. You can't take him away from me. And as for you dragging my name through the mud with your parents, that's low. Even for you, low. My voice rose, and I had to take a deep breath to steady it. You have the nerve to talk about low? You and Donald humiliated me, tore apart my family, and now you're acting like you're the one who's been wronged? Spare me? Her tone shifted, becoming colder. You want to make this ugly? Fine. But don't forget, Thomas, I know things about you too. Things that wouldn't look so good in court. I froze, her words sinking in like icy daggers. This was her game, deflection, manipulation, threats. She was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. Go ahead, Karen, I said, my voice calm but venomous. Throw whatever you've got at me, but just know I'm not backing down. Jake deserves better than the two of you, and I'm going to make sure he gets it. She didn't respond, just hung up, leaving the line buzzing in my ear. I set the phone down and turned to my parents. My mom was pale, her hands clutching the DNA results like they were a lifeline. My dad looked ready to smash something, his fists clenched at his sides. What did she say? He asked, his voice tight. She's not going down without a fight, I said. And she's going to drag me through the mud to make it happen. My dad stepped closer, putting a hand on my shoulder. Then we fight back. She and Donald think they can play dirty? They have no idea who they're dealing with. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Jake. Karen and Donald had stolen so much from me, but I'd be damned if I let them take my son's future too. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of determination. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to win. The battle began the moment Karen returned that evening. She didn't come alone. She brought a lawyer with her, a woman in a sharp gray suit, carrying a stack of papers and an expression as cold as Karen's smug smile. I opened the door to see them standing there, and my gut churned, but I didn't flinch. Karen's face was a mask of self-assured confidence, as if she'd already won. "We need to talk," Karen said, her tone icy but controlled. "This is Sarah. She's here to make sure things remain civil while we discuss custody arrangements." I stepped aside, letting them enter, but my jaw tightened. "Funny, you think bringing a lawyer changes anything? You're not walking out of here with Jake." The lawyer, Sarah, gave a polite but insincere smile. "Mr. Sanders, I'd advise keeping an open mind. Custody battles can be draining for everyone involved, especially the child. It's better to resolve these things amicably," I repeated, narrowing my eyes. "You're representing a woman who lied about who fathered her child for 3 years. I don't think she's in a position to demand anything." Karen's smile faltered for a split second before she leaned in, her voice dripping with venom. "Thomas, don't make this harder than it has to be. Jake needs both of us, whether you like it or not." Before I could respond, my dad's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "The hell he does?" Karen and Sarah turned to see my parents standing in the hallway. My dad looked like he was ready to explode, while my mom held Jake in her arms, her face a mask of quiet determination. "Karen, you've got some nerve showing up here," my dad growled, stepping forward. "You and Donald betrayed this family in the worst possible way. And now you think you're going to waltz in here and demand custody? Over my dead body." Sarah raised a hand, her tone measured. "Let's all take a breath. This isn't about what's fair for the adults. It's about what's best for the child." "Exactly," I said, stepping closer to Karen. "And what's best for Jake is to stay with the person who actually cares about him, not the woman who used him as a cover for her affair." Karen's facade cracked, and her voice rose. "You don't get to decide what's best for him, Thomas. You're not even his biological father." The room fell silent. The words hung in the air, heavier than I could have imagined. Jake stirred in my mom's arms, and she instinctively tightened her hold on him. My dad was the first to speak, his voice low and furious. "You're right, Karen. He's not Jake's biological father, but he's the only father that boy has ever known. And he's a damn sight better parent than you'll ever be." Karen's lawyer glanced at her, clearly uneasy with the direction things were heading. "Karen," Sarah said quietly, "perhaps we should reconsider." "No," Karen snapped, cutting her off. Her eyes were wild now, her calm demeanor completely shattered. "I'm not letting him win. Jake is my son, and I won't let Thomas poison him against me." I stepped closer, my voice cold and steady. "The only person poisoning Jake's life is you, Karen. And if you think a lawyer and some empty threats are going to scare me, you don't know me at all." Karen's face twisted in frustration, and she turned to Sarah. "We're done here. Let's go." As they stormed out, Karen threw one last parting shot over her shoulder. "This isn't over, Thomas. Not by a long shot." I closed the door behind them, locking it with deliberate finality. My parents were silent for a moment before my mom spoke, her voice trembling. "Thomas, what are you going to do?" I turned to her, my jaw set. "I'm going to fight. For Jake. For everything they took from me. And I'm not stopping until they both pay for what they've done." The determination in my voice left no room for doubt. This wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about justice. For Jake, for me, and for the life they had tried to destroy. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and sleepless nights. Karen wasn't bluffing when she said this wasn't over. She filed for joint custody almost immediately after leaving the house, claiming that I was emotionally unstable and unfit to care for Jake alone. Her petition included everything she could think of to paint me as the villain. Accusations of controlling behavior, claims that I was overly aggressive, and even a vague insinuation that I had anger issues. But her most disgusting move? She tried to use Jake's well-being as leverage. arguing that he needed a stable, two-parent environment and that my parents' involvement was proof I couldn't handle being a father on my own. It was infuriating, but it also fueled me. Every false claim she made was another piece of evidence that this wasn't about Jake's best interests. It was about her pride. My lawyer, Diane, was sharp, calm, and ruthless. She picked apart Karen's petition line by line, exposing every lie and contradiction. "Thomas," she said during one of our meetings, "your case is strong. You've been Jake's primary caregiver, and we can prove Karen's behavior has been detrimental to his well-being. But if you want to win this, we need more than just a good argument. We need something that leaves no doubt in the court's mind." I knew exactly what she meant. We needed evidence. That night, I sat in the dimly lit living room, scrolling through my phone. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe messages, photos, anything that could give us an edge. Then it hit me. Donald. For all his smugness, Donald was careless. Donald loved to show off, loved to boast. And if there was one thing I knew about him, it was that he couldn't resist bragging about his conquests. I reached out to an old friend of ours, Marcus, who had known Donald since high school. We weren't close anymore, but I remembered how Donald used to spill secrets around him after a few drinks. Marcus answered my call after a few rings, his voice cautious. "Thomas? Man, it's been a while. What's up?" I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Marcus, I need your help. It's about Donald and Karen." He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Yeah, I heard about that mess. What do you need?" I explained the situation, leaving out no details. To my surprise, Marcus didn't seem shocked. "Donald's always been a snake," he said, "but I didn't think he'd go this far. Look, I might have something for you. A couple of months ago, he was drunk at a party, running his mouth about how he had one-upped you. Said something about Jake, too. My chest tightened. Do you have proof? Anything at all?" "I don't," Marcus admitted, "but there were other people there. If you can find someone who recorded it." "Marcus?" I interrupted, my mind racing. "Do you know who else was at that party?" He rattled off a few names and one stuck out. Alex, Donald's old college buddy, known for recording everything on his phone. If Alex had been at that party, there was a chance he had the proof I needed. I tracked Alex down through social media and messaged him, playing on his dislike for Donald. It didn't take long for him to respond, confirming he had a video from that night. When I met Alex the next day, he handed me a USB drive. "Donald's a jerk," he said simply. "If this helps take him down, good." I didn't wait to watch the video. Back at Diane's office, we plugged the drive into her computer and played the file. There he was, Donald, slurring his words and holding a drink, surrounded by laughter. "Thomas? Oh, he has no idea," Donald sneered. "Jake's mine. Always has been. Poor guy thinks he's a dad. Karen's a real catch though, huh? Keeping it all under wraps like that? Genius." My fists clenched as the video ended, but Diane's expression was one of triumph. "This changes everything," she said, her voice brimming with confidence. It wasn't just evidence. It was a confession, clear and undeniable. The next court hearing couldn't come fast enough. As I sat in the courtroom, watching Karen and Donald's smug expressions, I felt a grim satisfaction knowing what was coming. When the judge allowed Diane to present the video, the shift in the room was palpable. Karen's face went pale, and Donald's bravado crumbled. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Your Honor," Diane said firmly, "this video not only confirms Mr. Sanders' suspicions, but also demonstrates a pattern of deceit and manipulation by both Ms. Sanders and Mr. Donald Sanders." The judge's gaze bore into Karen and Donald, who sat frozen, unable to respond. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The tide had turned, and this time it was in my favor. The courtroom was silent as the video ended, the weight of Donald's drunken confession settling over everyone like a storm cloud. Karen sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, her carefully rehearsed facade shattered. Donald, on the other hand, looked as though he might bolt from his seat at any moment. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "Ms. Sanders, Mr. Sanders, do you have anything to say in response to this evidence?" Karen's lawyer, Sarah, stood slowly, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. "Your Honor, this video, while damning, does not change the fact that Ms. Sanders is Jake's biological mother and has been his primary caregiver alongside Mr. Sanders. Diane immediately rose to her feet. Your Honor, while the biological connection cannot be disputed, the behavior captured in this video speaks volumes about the priorities and character of both Ms. Sanders and Mr. Donald Sanders. They willingly perpetuated a lie for years, using Jake as a pawn in their deception. This is not behavior befitting a parent who prioritizes the well-being of their child. The judge nodded thoughtfully, his gaze shifting between the two sides. Ms. Sanders, do you wish to address these claims directly? Karen hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table, so tightly her knuckles turned white. Your Honor, she began, her voice unsteady. Whatever mistakes I've made, they were not meant to harm Jake. He is my son, and I love him more than anything. Mr. Sanders is trying to take him away from me out of spite. Spite, I muttered under my breath, earning a sharp look from Diane to stay composed. The judge raised a hand to silence the murmurs in the courtroom. Mr. Sanders, he said, addressing me directly, what is your response to Ms. Sanders' statement? I stood, my legs trembling, but my voice steady. Your Honor, this isn't about spite. This is about protecting Jake from the lies and manipulation that have defined Karen and Donald's actions. I've been his father since the day he was born. I've loved him, cared for him, and built a life around him. Karen may be his biological mother, but she put her selfishness above his well-being. I turned, locking eyes with my brother, who flinched under the weight of my glare. Donald doesn't deserve to be anywhere near Jake. He isn't a father. He's a coward who thinks he can lie and cheat his way through life. Neither of them is fit to make decisions about Jake's future. The room buzzed with hushed whispers, but the judge silenced them with a bang of his gavel. Enough, he said firmly. I've heard enough from both sides. I'll take the evidence under advisement and make my ruling shortly. Karen's face was a mix of panic and fury as we were dismissed. Donald avoided looking at me entirely, slinking out of the courtroom like the rat he was. Back in Diane's office, the tension was palpable. My parents were there, along with Jake, who was happily playing with some toys in the corner, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around him. That video was a game changer, Diane said, pacing the room. If the judge has any sense of integrity, you'll walk away with full custody, Thomas. But Karen won't go quietly. Be prepared for her to escalate. I nodded, already bracing myself for whatever she had planned. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw Karen's name. I debated ignoring it, but decided to answer. What do you want, Karen? Her voice was sharp, almost desperate. You think you've won, don't you? You think that video is going to make the judge hand Jake over to you? You're delusional, Thomas. I'll fight you until you're broke. I'll drag this out for years if I have to. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice calm. You've already lost, Karen. That video isn't just evidence. It's the truth. And no matter how much you scream and threaten, the truth is on my side. You're so smug, she snapped. But let's see how smug you are when Jake starts asking why his daddy isn't really his daddy. Let's see how long you last when the lies start unraveling around you, Thomas. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me gripping the phone tightly, my heart pounding with anger. She's desperate, Diane said, watching me closely. That's good. It means she knows she's losing. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. Desperate or not, she's not going to stop until she's forced to. Diane nodded. Then let's make sure the judge does exactly that. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like the end was finally within reach. The court date for the final ruling came faster than I expected, but the tension leading up to it felt like an eternity. Every moment was a mix of hope and dread, the stakes higher than I ever thought possible. Karen hadn't made good on her threats to escalate yet, but I could see her unraveling. She showed up to court that morning with Donald by her side, the two of them a united front of arrogance and defiance. As we filed into the courtroom, my parents stayed back with Jake, who was safely at home with a sitter. I couldn't risk him witnessing any of this, and I didn't trust Karen to keep her temper in check. Diane gave me a reassuring nod as we sat down, but my heart was pounding. The judge entered, his expression unreadable. Everyone rose, then sat as he began to speak. I have reviewed all evidence and testimony provided in this case. He began, his tone measured and deliberate. This is not a decision I take lightly, as the well-being of a child is at stake. However, the evidence paints a clear picture of deceit, manipulation, and a lack of regard for the stability of the child's home life on the part of Ms. Sanders and Mr. Donald Sanders. Karen's face was pale, but Donald shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly shaken. The judge continued, his gaze fixed on Karen. Ms. Sanders, your actions, particularly the sustained dishonesty regarding the paternity of your son, raised serious concerns about your judgment and priorities. While you are Jake's biological mother, your behavior demonstrates a pattern that is not conducive to providing a stable and healthy environment for him. He turned to me, his expression softening slightly. Mr. Sanders, though you are not Jake's biological father, it is evident that you have been his primary caregiver, his source of stability, and the person who has acted in his best interests throughout his life. For that reason, this court awards you sole physical and legal custody of Jake. The words hit me like a tidal wave of relief. But the judge wasn't finished. Ms. Sanders, he said sternly, you will retain supervised visitation rights for the time being. This arrangement may be revisited after a 6-month period, provided there is evidence of genuine efforts to prioritize Jake's well-being and rebuild trust. Karen shot to her feet, her lawyer trying unsuccessfully to pull her back down. This is outrageous, she shouted. He's not even Jake's father. He's using my son to punish me. The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing her. Ms. Sanders, another outburst like that, and you will be held in contempt of court. This decision is final. I suggest you use your visitation time wisely if you want to be a meaningful part of Jake's life. Karen sat down, her face red with fury, but she didn't say another word. Donald, who had been trying to avoid eye contact with everyone, looked like he was about to bolt from the room. As the session adjourned, Karen stormed out, her lawyer trailing behind her. Donald hesitated, glancing at me like he wanted to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I stood tall, locking eyes with him. Don't even try it, I said quietly but firmly. You've done enough damage. Stay out of my life and stay away from Jake. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but whatever he saw in my expression stopped him. He nodded slightly, then turned and walked out of the courtroom without another word. Diane placed a hand on my shoulder as we exited the courthouse. You did it, Thomas. You fought for Jake, and you won. The weight that had been pressing on me for months seemed to lift all at once. But it wasn't just relief I felt. It was resolve. This was only the beginning. I had custody, but I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily. When I got home, Jake ran to me, throwing his little arms around my legs. I scooped him up, holding him tightly, tears stinging my eyes. You're staying with me, buddy, I whispered. Forever. That night, as Jake slept peacefully in his room, I sat with my parents at the kitchen table. My dad poured us each a glass of whiskey, raising his in a silent toast. To the truth, he said, his voice steady, and to never letting people like Karen and Donald win. I nodded, clinking my glass with his. The fight wasn't over. But I knew now that I had the strength to face whatever came next. For Jake, for myself, and for the life we deserved. In the weeks following the court's decision, Karen's bitterness turned into desperation. She began showing up unannounced during her scheduled visitation times, often with half-hearted attempts to seem like the doting mother. Jake, however, was wary of her. At 3 years old, he didn't fully understand what was happening, but he sensed the tension. Her visits were strained, filled with forced smiles and hollow questions, and Jake often clung to me the moment she left. Meanwhile, Donald disappeared. No texts, no calls, not even a smug message to try and justify himself. I found out through mutual acquaintances that he had sold his condo and left town. Some said he'd gone to stay with a friend on the West Coast. Others said he was couch surfing, struggling with debts after being disowned by my parents. Wherever he was, I didn't care. As far as I was concerned, he didn't exist. Karen's attempts to regain control escalated. She tried to manipulate me during drop-offs, using Jake as leverage. You know, she said one day, her tone saccharine, Jake needs a mother. He's confused. If we work together, maybe we could give him some normalcy. I didn't bite. The only thing confusing Jake is your behavior, I said calmly. If you want a relationship with him, start acting like a mother, not a manipulator. Her mask slipped, and she hissed, "You'll regret this, Thomas. You're not a saint, and people will see that eventually." I didn't flinch. Her threats were losing their power, and I wasn't afraid anymore. Then came the surprise that shifted everything. Late one evening, I received an email from Donald. The subject line read, "I owe you an explanation." I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. His words were surprisingly candid, almost remorseful. "Thomas, I know I've done unforgivable things, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I've lost everything, our family, my friends, and my dignity. You were right about me all along. I'm a coward. I used to blame you for everything wrong in my life, but the truth is I ruined my own life. Karen and I, it was never about love. It was about me trying to prove I was better than you, and I failed. You deserve better, and Jake deserves better. I won't bother you again, but I needed you to know I'm sorry. Not that it fixes anything, but I had to say it. Take care of Jake. He's lucky to have you." For a moment, I just stared at the screen, torn between anger and a flicker of pity. Donald's words didn't absolve him, but they felt like a surrender. For the first time, I saw him for what he truly was: broken, pathetic, and utterly alone. I forwarded the email to Diane, just in case it ever became useful. But for me, it wasn't about leverage. It was a reminder that I had already won the only battle that mattered. Jake was safe, and I was finally free from their lies. The war was over. All that was left was moving forward. Months passed, and life finally began to stabilize. Jake flourished in the calm, predictable environment I worked so hard to create for him. My parents were a constant source of support, their love for Jake evident in every moment they spent with him. The wounds left by Karen and Donald hadn't completely healed, but each day felt a little lighter, a little freer. Karen's supervised visits became less frequent. At first, she tried to maintain control, acting as though she could still manipulate the situation. But as time wore on, her efforts waned. She stopped showing up for scheduled visits, often citing emergencies or sending last-minute excuses through her lawyer. Jake stopped asking about her, and while it broke my heart that he didn't have a stable mother in his life, I knew he was better off without the chaos she brought. The final blow came when Karen's lawyer contacted Diane with an unexpected proposition. Karen wanted to relinquish her parental rights entirely. The explanation was as hollow as it was predictable. She claimed it was for Jake's best interests, but we all knew it was about her. She didn't want the burden of responsibility or the constant reminder of what she'd lost. It was bittersweet. On one hand, it felt like a victory, a final severing of the toxic ties she had used to control me. On the other hand, it was yet another betrayal, this time directed at Jake. How could a mother simply give up her child? But as Diane reminded me, this was a gift in disguise. Without Karen's interference, I could give Jake the life he deserved. The day the paperwork was finalized, I sat with Jake in our backyard, watching him play in the grass. He was laughing, chasing after a butterfly, his world unburdened by the storm that had once surrounded him. "Hey, buddy," I said as he came running over to me. "You know how much I love you, right?" He nodded, grinning up at me. "Love you too, Daddy." Those words were all I needed. They weren't about biology, DNA tests, or court battles. They were about the bond we had built, the bond no one, not Karen or Donald, could ever take away. That night, I sat down to write an email, not to Karen or Donald, but to myself, a reminder of everything I had learned through this journey. To anyone in my position, fight. Don't let betrayal break you. Don't let liars win. Protect the people who matter, even if it costs you everything. Because in the end, the truth matters. Love matters. And if you hold on to that, you can survive anything. When I hit send, sending it to an empty inbox I'd created for moments like this, it felt like the final chapter had closed. Through betrayal, heartbreak, and the toughest battles, this story proves that love and truth will always prevail. It's not about the DNA, it's about the bond we build, the people we protect, and the courage to fight for what truly matters. Let this be a reminder. No matter how dark the storm, you can find your way to the light. Thank you for watching, and remember, the power to rebuild starts within you.